What's up, gang? Thanks for listening to the Undiplomatic Podcast, the show with undiplomatic takes about the foreign policy scene. I'm your host, Van Jackson. My guest today is a senior lecturer in international relations at the Coral Bell School of Asia and the Pacific at Australian National University. He's very active in the Australian foreign policy conversation, and he's published a slew of journal articles on nukes, strategic stability, weapons trends, polarity, English school IR, great power shit, even progressive foreign policy from an Australian standpoint, which is doubly interesting. My guest is, of course, Dr. Benjamin Zala. Welcome to the show, brother. How you doing?
Hey, Van. Thanks very much. Nice to be on a show that I'm already a card-carrying fan of and a regular listener.
New friend of the pod. All right. So we're doing this episode to talk about what you and a couple other scholars have started characterizing as like a third nuclear age. And when we talk about ages from the perspective of like weapons, there's a way in which we're talking about a kind of change of terrain, like a shift in the conventional wisdom about incentives and risks of strategy and military choices. But just because it's like the conventional wisdom doesn't mean that it's like true or correct. So in a way, we're looking at how strategists are extrapolating from global trends and such. But, the reason why it ends up mattering in the real world, it's like, well, if you believe this stuff, even if it's not true, it's going to affect the choices of states and militaries and all that. And it's great to have you here because in the early episodes of the podcast, we used to do this kind of topic a lot more, but A, my audience has kind of shifted over time, and then B, I became mindful that this kind of conversation gets very jargony and esoteric, like very quickly. So as we go through the discussion today, I may pause us, here and there to clarify terms and things for people listening, watching. So on the one hand, we're having our own discussion, me and you. On the other hand, in order for people to be a fly on the wall and understand what's going on, we may have to like break the fourth wall every so often.
Please do. It's one of my pet hates in this area, that the jargons, the acronyms, because it becomes esoteric, right? It's a great way of locking people out of a conversation to be SLBM this and MRV that and whatever. And people are sitting thinking, I don't know what you're talking about, and there's no need to do it, but we use them as shorthand, right? Because you're in this world all the time, you get sick of saying intercontinental ballistic missile in every sentence, right?
Yes,
so whenever I let my guard down and drop one of those annoying acronyms, pull me up and ask me what it means.
Yeah, I'll try. So I do it too, so we'll monitor each other.
Yeah, right.
All right. So you have what I think is like a fairly groundbreaking article in the European Journal of International Security with Andrew Futter, and it's called Strategic Non-Nuclear Weapons and the Onset of a Third Nuclear Age. So obviously, if there's a third nuclear age, potentially, then there were prior nuclear ages. So to start off, can you give us like a snapshot of what the first nuclear age was, how it was characterized, what time period it covered, all that?
Yeah, sure. And I think you're absolutely right to start by sort of, to use the trendy phrase, problematizing a bit the idea of nuclear ages. And it's a really odd thing. And this is coming from a co-author of an article about a new nuclear age, right? Like, are you mad? So it's
You're self-conscious of it, though, which is good.
Right. It's something that Drew and I really struggled with because, as you've alluded to, the central argument of the piece is thinking in terms of a second nuclear age, deciding that we lived in a second nuclear age and it's all changed now and so forth, has produced a whole set of trends that we're arguing is actually creating a third nuclear age. Mm-hmm. So the first thing to say is periodization of all kinds of history is tricky, imperfect, strange. It's a strange world to enter into. And that's periodization of all kinds, right? Like, the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages or however it is that you're trying to break up, early modern, pre-modern, late modern. These are all different ways of trying to make sense of and compartmentalize a big, long, messy history.
Yeah.
And so with the nuclear age that obviously starts in 1945, actually it was some time into the period that they define as the second nuclear age, but sort of in the mid to late 90s, a whole bunch of scholars started referring to the post-Cold War era as the second nuclear age. So that basically tells us that in their minds, the first nuclear age pretty much lines up with the Cold War.
Mm-hmm.
It's basically 45, and then you got that tricky thing. I'm pretty sure from memory in the article, we kind of, sort of swiveled around, or where do you want to put the end date of the Cold War? Is it the Berlin Wall coming down in 89? Is it the formal dissolving of the Union in 91? Whatever. But it's basically the first nuclear age is the Cold War period. And it's therefore associated with the two major nuclear armed actors. So it's really associated very much with the nuclear policies of the US and the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
And it's associated with arms racing between the two, with capital T, nuclear arms race, associated with the development of nuclear doctrine.
Mm-hmm.
Remember, nuclear doctrine didn't exist because nuclear weapons didn't exist. We hadn't had to think about them before. And particularly associated with a particular doctrine that became known as mutual assured destruction. So the idea that if we are to find stability in a nuclear armed world short of getting rid of those nuclear weapons, then the way that they're postured should be towards deterrence rather than war fighting.
Mm-hmm.
And the most stable way of doing that is having both sides trying to deter each other, and therefore both sides be mutually vulnerable to each other. It's a kind of a pessimistic outlook that says the only reason I'm not destroying Van Jackson is because I'm concerned about the possibility of Van Jackson not being able to destroy it all in one go, and Van being able to respond in kind and destroy me. So that's why it's mutual assured destruction, right?
Mm-hmm.
So these ideas, arms racing, even the space race, so very much on kind of what we call vertical proliferation, as in growing the stockpiles of states who already have nuclear weapons,
Mm-hmm.
more than horizontal proliferation, the spread to new states. These are all the things we associate with the first nuclear age. And often the phrase, it's very old-fashioned now, people don't say it, which tells us something about how these things change, the idea of the central balance, that the balance, the nuclear balance between these two actors, the Soviet Union and the United States, is the most important thing that we need to worry about. And, we'll care about nuclear armed alliances like NATO, we'll care about new actors like Britain, and then France, and then China, and we'll even care enough to negotiate a big treaty to kind of stop that spread. You get the NPT during the first nuclear age, right? NPT being the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Thank you. That was good. I didn't have to pause you. Right?
Yeah. And so, it's not that the things that we started to care more about in the so-called second nuclear age, in the kind of post-Cold War era, were absent, just that they took a back seat to these other concerns, which was basically averting the prospect of nuclear war between the two superpowers. That was the number one thing on the kind of the desks of decision makers in capitals that mattered during the first nuclear age.
Yeah. So, okay, first nuclear age, Cold War, nukes are super rare, super hard to get. Classical arms racing is a major strategic concern. The value of nukes in that setting, or as far as like the US and the Soviets are concerned, is really to bolster mutually assured destruction, or and for other states, mutual vulnerability, I guess. This first nuclear age also gave birth to the nuclear revolution, which you sort of hinted at there.
Yeah.
And this is an important concept. It's still prominent, but now that it's more controversial.
That's right.
And I guess to start, how do you define the nuclear revolution? And then maybe we can talk about it.
Yeah. It's a really good point. And there's some really interesting work that's come out in the last few years that I characterize as a kind of revisionist take on the nuclear revolution, because they're basically saying, actually, do you know what? During the first nuclear age, the revolution was not quite as widespread and internalized as we like to tell ourselves that it was. If you go back and look at policies, people were trying to escape the nuclear revolution all the time. I actually don't agree with all of the scholarship.
I was going to say, I don't agree with it either.
No, I think it overacts the pudding in various ways. I just don't think you can explain something like the anti-ballistic missile treaty, right? Where both sides agree to limit their ability to defend themselves, because they reluctantly, of course, recognize that each side has to remain roughly as vulnerable as the other, or it's going to be a very unstable system. Mm-hmm. But so the idea of the nuclear revolution is it was a revolution in thinking about warfare, right? And there's a whole bunch of lovely quotes that illustrate this from people, in 1945, 1946, 1947, trying to get their heads around this, that all boil down to kind of variations on the theme, which is to basically say, in the past, the role of our armed forces was to fight wars and win wars.
Mm-hmm.
And now their role is to avoid fighting the war in the first place, because the war would be so destructive that there'd be nothing left to fight for, right?
Yeah.
And that is a revolutionary way of thinking about warfare at that point in history.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't have generals sitting around working out, how do we not start a war here? That was for political types, right? The role of the general is to come in and tell you how, if we're in this war, this is how we're going to win it, right? And it's not that they completely stopped doing that. So no one's arguing that, any of the Cold War conflicts, right? That either side in the Korean War were not trying to win. Of course they were, but they were limited in what they did because they didn't want to start a nuclear war, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a reason why the US in between 1950 and 1953 during the Korean War opted not to go for that nice tool in the toolbox that it's only had for 5 years now, that worked really well at the end of the last war, right? And there were members of the US Armed Forces, very high up, members of the US Senate and so forth, all saying, we're putting all this money into this super weapon. We've built it. Why aren't we using it? Why are we sending our young kids off to war to probably die in that war, and not using a weapon that can bring that war to an end, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it was a change in the way we thought about how war works in world politics, what the military is for, and particularly what this type of weaponry is for, and the idea that it would become used for deterrent purpose only, that the use of a nuclear weapon is to threaten someone else to not use their nuclear weapon, rather than, weapons are there to be used in warfare, right? They're there to help you win. This was a very different way of thinking about weapons. Should also say that, so some of this revisionist history is basically saying, yeah, but it's not like that was complete and total across all aspects of military thinking on, say, both sides of that Cold War divide. There were still people arguing for nuclear victory, and there were still policies aimed at achieving victory against a nuclear armed power. We didn't fully accept vulnerability. Scholars will say we did track and then tail Soviet nuclear armed submarines, rather than seeing where they were and saying, do you know what, let them go, because they need to have those survivable second strike capabilities, right, to be able to retaliate. They went, no, we want to know exactly where they are, because if this all kicks off, we're going to sink those submarines, right? So it's not that it was this kind of total revolution and everyone said, yep, got it, cool, we're never going to have a major power war ever again. Both sides prepared and spent money hand over fist to try and give themselves the best chance of winning a major power war during this period. But it did change the way that states acted. It forced them into some degree of restraint that I think you just can't explain otherwise without that kind of revolution in thinking.
Yeah. The logic of mutually assured destruction, the logic that you cannot win a nuclear war in the traditional sense, that obviously seems to hold, and it has some explanatory power. I guess the thing that the nuclear revolution thesis doesn't fully account for is well, why are they arms racing if they accept MAD,
exactly.
right?
Yeah.
There's no point.
And I think there's actually a relatively, and I say relatively, in practice it's complex and nuanced and difficult to pinpoint whatever, but there's a relatively simple causal explanation, which is to say, okay, so if you were going to accept MAD, you're kind of accepting that there is an upper limit to all of this, that there is that we basically know what parity, so as in matching each other weapon for weapon, looks like. In practice, it's much, much harder than that. Think of the, there was a famous episode in US domestic politics as President Kennedy was coming to power, that's referred to as the kind of missile gap episode, right? Where sort of elements of the US political machine were convincing themselves that there's a missile gap between us and the Soviets. The Soviets are ahead of us. Then it actually turned out that was just not even close to being the case. It just was wildly inaccurate. Yet one side convinced itself that it had to develop all these missiles because we're falling behind. Well, what's the other side going to do? They sit there and go, look at them. They've made this excuse. They're saying they're falling behind, but they know they're not. Come on, guys. And what they're trying to do is get one up on us. So we'll have to return in kind. So basically, you explain the nuclear revolution coexisting with arms racing because the security dilemma, which is a phrase we might have to explain.
I was going to say quite a dilemma.
Yep, it doesn't disappear, right?
Yeah.
So the security dilemma in basic terms is that the things that I do quite genuinely to defend myself, so it has to be genuinely defensive intent. People often get this wrong. If I have offensive intent, well, it's not the security dilemma. We're just talking about something else, right?
Yep.
But the things that I do to genuinely defend myself and make myself more secure, and I wish you no harm. I'm just worried about you or others or whatever it is, right? I'm just trying to defend myself, can have a dual use, can also be used to threaten you. And so you face no choice there, really. Well, you do actually face a choice, and that's where the security dilemma comes in. But you are being incentivized to respond in kind. And when you do that, my worst fears are confirmed. Oh, I knew you had hostile intent. Well, I better secure. And that's how we end up in spiraling and arms racing. And this is stuff that IR theorists have looked at for decades now. And the really sad part about it is it doesn't disappear. Yeah. It doesn't just go away because you've decided to think otherwise, right? You still send signals, and the only actor that gets to decide how that signal is received is the actor themselves. It doesn't matter what you say or what you try to do or whatever. If they decide you have hostile intent, or that you might in the future, even if I do trust you now, I can't trust your successor in the future. This is what drives arms racing, and we still see that today.
Yeah. And the more you try to rationally optimize your military security, the more it's going to feed the dilemma, which is part of the dilemma.
Yeah.
This episode is going to be a great resource for my security studies course. I'm going to assign it.
Glad to oblige. But it's interesting to kind of circle back and link this together so that we're not, going off on rambling tangents and chatting about the complexities of the security dilemma. This all matters for the first nuclear age, right? Because one of the things that the first nuclear age ends up over time, and this is really important to understand too, right? This doesn't happen in 1945. The revolution in thinking doesn't happen and everyone goes, okay, great. We don't need to engage in any of these dangerous practices. Stability is the goal. Excellent. Far from it, right? We get the Cuban Missile Crisis because it takes quite a while. We get 2 Berlin crises. It takes quite a while to figure out how you do this, how you live in this extremely dangerous world with this new form of weaponry that is just unlike anything else we've ever had before. And so over time, what develops in the Cold War is a sense that all this stuff really matters, and a kind of an understanding at the policy level, never articulated using the phrase the security dilemma, right? That's for us fusty old academics in our ivory tower. But the concept of the security dilemma becomes part of international political life. And you see states like the Soviet Union and the US engaging in arms control agreements and so forth to restrain themselves voluntarily, but making sure that they're both doing it out of a recognition that the security dilemma is real, that we can't just keep pushing each other into this arms race. We've got to put the brakes on somewhere. And that involves recognizing a bit that my actions can seem threatening to others.
Yeah. There's a reflexive property or principle when awareness about a security dilemma, whether you're using the phrase or not, actually induces a kind of restraint that or like it influences policy in a way that encourages stability.
And speaking of over-egging the pudding, we should say, like, this didn't come easily. It wasn't there all the time. It was kind of rare, actually. But we should also give due credit to 2 British scholars, Nick Wheeler and Ken Booth, who coined a really nice phrase for exactly what we're talking about, which is security dilemma sensibility, right? It is actually possible for leaders to get it, and they might not even need to read academic articles to do so. But they can understand that their own actions can have unintended consequences and act accordingly. And you kind of call that a sensibility to the idea of the security dilemma.
Yeah, totally. Good reference too. Okay, so how do you describe the second nuclear age then, and what made it different from the first?
So the second nuclear age comes about by decision makers and analysts and pundits and so forth deciding that everything has changed. Looking at the world and saying, well, the Cold War's over. The Soviet Union doesn't even exist anymore post the end of 91, and the Russian Federation that has replaced it seems to be relatively weak. And early on in that stage, may even be sort of coming over to our side of the ledger in terms of kind of broad ideological persuasion and so forth. And there was lots of, I think, very misplaced optimism about all of that, right? But where concerns about nuclear weapons therefore shifted to was away from this idea of the central balance and stability between the two major nuclear armed powers, who we should note still accounted for and still today account for about 90% of nuclear warheads in stockpiles around the world. So this weird thing happens where we decide the world's changed and threats are different and so forth. But in material terms, these two states, the now Russian Federation and the United States, in terms of nuclear numbers, stand head and shoulders above all the rest. So in that sense, again, to use a geeky IR term that we might come to later on, it's a kind of a bipolar, bipolarity ended, right? Because one of the poles, which was the Soviet Union, fell apart. There was only one pole left, so we entered the unipolar moment. But in nuclear terms, it remained extremely bipolar. Those two are the two that count, and then there's a bunch of others. But because of the lack of political confrontation, strategic confrontation, there was this sense that nuclear dangers are elsewhere. And this was very much driven by both policy and discussion in the United States and then US allies. And so then you might say the West more broadly. They started talking about this as a second nuclear age where things are different enough that we should think of it as sort of qualitatively different in this periodization terms, right? And the key kind of hallmarks of this is not arms racing between the superpowers and the central balance and mutually assured destruction and all the rest, all the stuff we'd become used to. That was now a very old hat. Now the things we needed to worry about is so-called rogue states, which we know this is a Western-led idea because that's a Western concept, right?
Mostly North Korea, but yeah.
I mean, we'll tell you who the rogues are, and it's certainly not us as we blatantly break the UN Charter.
Not us, yeah.
Any of that, right? We will name the rogues. We'll even sometimes put them in a list for you. It's very helpful. we'll give it a nice title like the Axis of Evil or
Axis, Outposts, yeah.
But that's where nuclear threats emanate from. It's a return to worrying about proliferation, horizontal proliferation, so the spread to new states. So, of course, a lot of the concern comes about in the aftermath of the first Gulf War in 1991, where the whole sort of non-proliferation regime that's been built up and seemed to be working unbelievably well, that only a tiny minority of states have decided to opt to get themselves the most destructive weapon in human history, and the vast majority have sort of done what might seem illogical and said, no, we're good. We're not going to build these. And that's basically, in my view, it's down to kind of a mutual distrust, right? We're not building them not because we're good guys, but we don't want our neighbors having them. And so if we all do this together, that's a safer world for us. Or you might say that's also it requires some form of trust as well, but it's a sort of a mix of trust and distrust. And so in the aftermath of the first Gulf War, when US forces are in there and they get weapons inspectors in there, they find out that actually Iraq, who on paper had been a member in good standing of the non-proliferation regime, had been cheating and had been cheating for some time and had gotten a very long way towards building a nuclear weapons program. That had they not done the really dumb thing and invaded Kuwait and had...
Yes. This is Iraq of the 90s, by the way, 80s and 90s, not...
80s, 90s Iraq, not
2003 right? Iraq.
Yeah, this comes back around in 2003, right, where the allegation remained and they didn't, because actually the weapons inspectors had gotten rid of everything and Iraq was bluffing and they actually didn't have the weapons that they wouldn't confirm that they definitely didn't have, right? They kept giving inspectors a run around to just try and hedge their bets a little bit, whilst also saying what ended up to be true, that they didn't have those weapons anymore. So the concern, a lot of the sort of second nuclear age stuff is this genuine psychological shock that, wow, the non-proliferation regime isn't quite as foolproof as we thought. There's big gaping holes in it. And states can cheat and they can have clandestine programs. So it becomes a concern about horizontal proliferation, also a concern about nuclear terrorism, non-state actors. If you're not going to worry about superpowers because there aren't these two superpowers that exist anymore, we've got to worry about something else. What about non-state actors? Yeah, I mean, that's always been a threat since the nuclear age began. There's always been non-state actors who might want them. And so all the panic became about, nuclear terrorism and so forth. A concern about nuclear security more broadly, the securing of nuclear materials. A lot of this comes about, again, in the aftermath of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And there's this concern about so-called loose nukes, that you had this massive nuclear stockpile in a superpower. The superpower quite literally dissolves and turns into a bunch of new independent countries, and also the Russian economy falls through the toilet, to put it, diplomatically. And so the concern is, who's looking after that massive nuclear stockpile that didn't dissolve when the Union did, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you have a much more collaborative, sort of open relationship conducive to cooperation between the US and the now Russian Federation on these matters. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And with all this goes a change in thinking. And people start saying, you know what, we don't need to think about the central balance. We don't need to think about sort of superpowers or great powers. We don't need to really think about the kind of the great power politics of nuclear weapons. That's all very old fashioned. That's an outdated way of thinking about this. That's how we had to do it in the Cold War. That was the first nuclear age. Really, we're in a new nuclear age now. We're in a second nuclear age, and we can think differently. And the really big thing that this creates is a relaxation of the attachment to the idea of mutual vulnerability and the sort of precarious nature of deterrence relationships. And it all gets symbolized most sort of pointedly, I guess, in the end of 2001. You have the 9/11 attacks in September. So the US is kind of, again, psychologically reeling from this sort of shocking event.
Mm-hmm.
They're worried about sort of bolt from the blue attacks from non-state actors or so-called rogue states or whatever it is. And the Bush Jr. administration announces, we're not going to be in that treaty with the Russians anymore that limited our missile defenses. That was for a previous age. That was for a bygone era in which mutual vulnerability between the two superpowers was more important than anything else. It's not as important anymore. We need to be able to defend ourselves with missile defenses, and the technology has moved on as well. Actually, this all gets going really in the end of the Clinton administration. He kicks it into the long grass. Bush Jr. makes a decision, and they unilaterally withdraw from the ABM treaty, which is the first time since the end of the Cold War that either side of that Cold War divide had pulled out of any of those Cold War treaties that had sort of kept the whole thing together.
Yeah.
And it's a kind of a key moment of it's the most, if you want like your champagne top shelf second nuclear age moment, withdrawing from the ABM treaty is the one.
Yeah. Under discussed, underappreciated as like a kind of pivot point.
Yeah.
Okay. So the second nuclear age, it has more horizontal nuclear proliferation as a concern and as a happening, I guess, on some level.
Yeah. I mean, India and Pakistan, concerns about North Korea, which then come to fruition, concerns about Iran, obviously.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so in a certain respect, nukes are getting easier to get. Weaker states are getting a hold of nukes. The rogue actor problem becomes a thing in the imagination that proliferates. Underlying a lot of this is like a concern, or what justifies all this focus on proliferation and rogues and stuff, is that they're not going to do what we do as responsible actors, right? Like they're not going to be responsible with their nukes like we would be, or they would do strategies that can't be deterred or something like that.
Absolutely, yeah. That was a key part of it, that these aren't necessarily deterrable actors. So you old Cold War warriors who just want to talk about deterrence and mutual vulnerability, like you're just not in the room anymore. You're not on the same page. These guys aren't deterrable.
Yeah, and you can see where that comes from, and you can see the basis for that. Like it's not unfounded, but there's also some like color subtext to that that's like discomforting or like should be questioned maybe. And to that end, you guys say in the piece, quote, "This is a periodization that of course makes more sense," talking about the ages, "that makes more sense from the perspective of an American or Western policy focused audience than it does from the perspective of the rest of the world." I agree with this. What are you saying there? You gestured at it with the whole rogue thing before, but
yeah. So I think there's two ways in which this makes sense, primarily from a Western point of view, right?
Mm-hmm.
The first is that the kind of those who might see themselves as either contemporary or at least, in the not too distant future, peer competitors, to use the contemporary phrase, the phrase we use a lot at the moment, of the United States. So those who fancy themselves as potential great powers, right? That basically say, this whole idea that history has ended. Thanks, Frank. It's Frank Fukuyama for those of you playing along at home. Great power politics is over and all the rest. There's a couple of actors in there, namely Russia and China, who go, we'll see. right? And when the US says, okay, everything's changed, we're in a new nuclear age now, we need to think very differently, and we might actually deploy certain capabilities that we had all agreed that we wouldn't do in the past, because that would be really destabilizing to that kind of central balance between the nuclear armed great powers. And the US is saying, well, this is all different now. We're going to deploy missile defenses, for example, because we need to defend against rogues and terrorists and all the rest.
Yeah.
The Chinese and the Russians just go, look, I'm really sorry, no. Because what you're asking us to do is to trust you that you're never going to use these defenses to undermine deterrence with us, and therefore give yourself the ability to have a first strike at our capabilities if we come into conflict with each other, and not have to worry about our retaliation, because you can soak it up with your whiz-bang missile defense shield, right?
Yeah.
If the thing works as well as you say it's going to work, that's a problem for us in exactly the same way it was in the so-called first nuclear age. So in other words, from the Russian and Chinese point of view, they say, you can talk about a second nuclear age until you're blue in the face. The dynamics of what you now call the first nuclear age didn't disappear because you decided they have. They're still right here. And
your defense makes you more offensive to us.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And the response from Washington never got any better than, trust us, we won't. And I know that sounds like I'm being kind of flippant and you must, listeners will probably think, well, come on, that must be unfair. They must have come up with more serious arguments. Nope. It's just, they didn't. I spent lots of time talking with people in the Pentagon, at Stratcom, across the US system about this, and trying to say, but you get where they're coming from, right? And they're like, no, because the system will always be limited and aimed at rogues. So it won't be big enough to defend against everything that the Russians still have, or everything that the Chinese would have. So they don't need to worry about it. It'll only be a limited system that can only defend against your Irans, your North Koreas, and so forth. And when you say, okay, how can you guarantee that you're going to keep it limited? They say, oh, we will. Because we're the good guys, right? So
our nukes are good.
Our intentions are always good. So they're asking the Chinese and the Russians to trust them on a handshake and a wink. And the Chinese and the Russians just kind of said, sorry, not good enough. That's not how the world works. We're going to have to respond in kind. We're going to have to make sure we have countermeasures to get over your missile defenses. And this is what's creating, this is where the argument gets, probably unnecessarily complex, but this is what's creating a third nuclear age. In other words, we say that it's the second nuclear age thinking, this decision that we're going to just perceive threats very differently and act accordingly. It's not just like it starts in the mind. It's a mental construct, periodization, right? It starts with you and I deciding that the world looks different. But what's important is it then changed our actions. And the action is, you withdraw from the ABM treaty and you deploy missile defenses. So before you know it, the second nuclear age, as it were, has been thought into existence. It's real now, right? Because you're now deploying technologies that you used to not deploy because you thought it was a bad idea to do so. And the response to that is what then creates a third nuclear age. We can kind of get to that, what that looks like. But that's the kind of the dilemma of second nuclear age thinking, right? That we decided everything was different. I should say, so that's the kind of great power element of this. That's the first reason why it really only makes sense from the West. If you said second nuclear age in London or DC or Canberra, people would sort of nod along and say, yep, know exactly what you mean. But if you said it in Moscow or Beijing, they'd look at you like you had two heads, right?
Yeah.
The other thing is that for the rest of the world, the nuclear age didn't change. Remember, the rest of the world have opted not to arm themselves with these weapons.
Yeah.
It's a tiny minority, right, that have these weapons, and the vast majority opt not to. From their point of view, that same division between nuclear haves and nuclear have-nots did not change. The numbers, crept up a little bit because India and Pakistan became overt about their previously covert systems where they were kind of arms racing against each other. So we added 2 more numbers, and then in 2006, the North Koreans. So we've got a third nuclear armed state. That's still a handful. The rest of the world, the entirety of the sub-Saharan African continent, the entirety of South America, in fact, the entirety of Latin America, are like, we're all still nuclear unarmed. So this whole thing of, nuclear ages have changed and the dynamics have changed, hasn't changed from our point of view. It's still, we're still as vulnerable as we were, right?
Yeah, I was going to say, I sort of mentioned this up at the very beginning of the episode, but just because we're talking about first, second, third nuclear age, we're talking about like tendencies within the imaginations of a group of elite people that's sometimes transnational. So
100%.
like basically like a cadre of nuclear strategists and some nuclear scholars,
Yep.
they start thinking like this, focusing on this kind of problem set. They start obeying this kind of logic and trying to sell it to others.
Yep.
And so it becomes real in that sense. But for us to talk about it is not to like validate it, but only to like
Exactly.
recognize its embeddedness in reality as in their minds and shit. Like
Exactly right. And like, so this was the hardest thing about writing that article, where we're like, we sort of tried to do it by talking about second nuclear age thinking and really emphasizing that. And we say explicitly that, you know, nuclear ages start in the mind, but then they end up influencing policy and they have real world effects. And therefore the second nuclear age comes about whether we like it or not. But it's a choice. Agency is absolutely critical to this. And actually in the article, we argue, the title of the article is The Onset of a Third Nuclear Age, right? And we kind of say, look, we are on the verge of a third nuclear age, but we're really, really clear that if that happens, it'll because we've made decisions that create a third nuclear age. We do not have to do this. Right? Arms races don't just happen. Like, I'm not a pure structuralist, right? Like, I don't think that arms races, that states are forced into arms racing. It's always a choice. But to pretend that the choices we have don't affect others in that kind of structural sense is also disingenuous, right? So
it's a way of, it's like a subheading for a set of logics and incentives that people start making real. And so it's like a common way to refer to it.
I mean, the sad thing is, I think we basically are now in the third nuclear age. The things that we point to, I think I'm seeing them play out. But yeah, we did want to kind of retain that idea that like there is nothing inevitable about this. There is nothing natural about this. If it happens, we are creating it.
Yeah. This is the difficulty of like trying to have a historical perspective or like a historical IR kind of take on things. Like when you retain that sensibility, it's hard to do that at the same time that you're developing like conceptual claims and branding and that kind of thing within the security studies space.
And this happens, right? Oh, now you're the third nuclear age guys. And we're like,
I know. I mean, when I saw the title of the article when it first came out, I was like, these fucking guys are selling a new donkey. Like, this is bullshit. And then I read it, I was like, oh, okay.
No, actually, I see their point. Right. Yeah. And it's really tricky. And I think the position that Drew, this is my co-author on this and sort of co-conspirator on these matters, Andrew Futter, who's at the University of Leicester in the UK, who's now running this great project that I'm involved with on the third nuclear age, right? Trying to understand the dynamics, and we're trying to give a global picture, trying to get out of that Western-centric mindset of what does the third nuclear age really look like all around the world, right? It's got this amazing team together doing really great work on this. But this is what we were really battling with, like that we see these dynamics at play. We want to be able to identify them and analyze them, not just for kind of scholarly analytical reasons, but for political reasons. If you just let this stuff just drift on through, it's, you know, it becomes policy and we make really bad policy decisions. But equally, we're not promoting it. We're not saying, you know, that we ought to be thinking in third nuclear. Oh, I guess we're kind of,
because Paul Bracken, I mean, he wrote a book called The Second Nuclear Age, and he was selling it. Like he was persuading others about like,
there's Paul Bracken,
buy into this,
and Keith Payne and Colin Gray and a whole bunch. It's kind of tricky, and that line between analyzing something and saying, hey, you guys are heading in this direction, that line, and then saying you need to be understanding that you're heading in that direction, but we're not saying you have to. Like, that's quite difficult to do.
I know.
In practice, right? Like, you know, this stuff, it's
even this conversation is going to be like a little
hard
for people to like retain in their heads. These are the features, et cetera, et cetera.
But on the one hand, we're saying it's not real, it's a mental construct, but on the other hand, it does have real world consequences, and like it's kind of contradictory and whatever. And you know, woe is us, poor old academics, right? Find some very small violins.
Okay. To that end, two related questions. What are strategic non-nuclear weapons? Examples, of course. And then what is the third nuclear age? Because these two questions go together.
Cool. So in fact, I might almost do the second question first as a way into that, right? So our argument is that the third nuclear age is, as I said, where it's coming from is old first nuclear age dynamics coming crashing into the policies that define the second nuclear age.
Mm-hmm.
And the result is that states are looking for new ways to try and regain parity and stability in those nuclear armed relationships, particularly at the great power level. And the way that they appear to be doing it currently, which is what's driving this third nuclear age, and what gives the third nuclear age a genuinely unique characteristic. And I think it's unique enough so that we can say actually it makes sense to think of it as fundamentally different to the second nuclear age, is a reliance on what Drew and I are now calling strategic non-nuclear weapons. There's a whole bunch of terms that get used to describe the same thing. We're actually both guilty of it. We've used different phrases in the past and so forth.
Advanced conventional weapons,
yep,
precision
exactly.
guided munitions.
So advanced conventional weapons, often a lot of this gets wrapped up into emerging technology.
Yeah.
Or, the tricky thing with advanced, in fact, shout out to James Acton of Carnegie, who convinced me that strategic non-nuclear weapons, albeit not being a perfect phrase and it's a bit clunky, it's probably the most accurate we've
More
got.
Precise, yeah.
Yeah, because if you say an advanced conventional weapon, I mean, because a conventional weapon is a handgun all the way up to a tank,
yeah,
you'd say, well, the advanced version of that is the tank, obviously, right? So what we're talking about here is conventional capabilities, so they don't use a nuclear explosion, but that can be used to compromise an adversary's nuclear capabilities. So that's where they become strategic, right? So it's a non-nuclear weapon that has a strategic impact. So what we're thinking about here is things like missile defense, but also offensive capabilities like anti-satellite capabilities, given that nuclear weapon systems rely for targeting and all sorts of things on satellite systems. So an anti-satellite capability, something that compromises a satellite, and that might be kinetically, can be literally the missile that hits it, or it might be something that jams the satellite signal or even just points it in the wrong direction, right? A satellite that's pointing the other way is useless to you. So anti-satellite weaponry, anti-submarine warfare capabilities, so things that can compromise nuclear-armed subs, and offensive capabilities like precision-guided, precision strike missiles that are conventionally armed. So all the, if you'll pardon the awful pun, hypersonics. I was saying all the hype is about hypersonics, right? Like that is an example of a conventionally armed but strategic weapon, or a weapon that has a strategic impact. And then there's kind of supporting systems that people are really interested, right? They're not weapons themselves, but it's sort of software or supporting architecture. So things like AI, quantum computing, big data, all this sort of stuff. Cyber capabilities.
Cyber, I was going to say cyber, yeah.
Cyber is the other one, right? Now, what people often get wrong about this stuff is that they think it's all new, which is why calling them new and emerging technologies is a bit of a misnomer. Like missile defenses have been around as long as missiles. Anti-submarine capabilities have been around as long as submarines, right? Lots of this stuff isn't new, but it's only coming on board to have a strategic effect now because of developments in technology, that basically computing has become much better, sensor technology has become much better than it was, and so forth. It's becoming easier to find, not easy, it's always difficult, but easier to find and target an adversary's nuclear capabilities. And that, we think, is fundamentally new in the nuclear age at that strategic level. The other thing that people often get wrong about these weapon systems is they look at them on their own. So you can have, and I guarantee you, I have the scars to prove it, you can have unbelievably uninteresting debates about the efficacy of missile defense systems, where people just look at them on their own and say, well, look at the testing rate. You know, the best system in the world is only knocking down targets coming in 50% of the time, right? Yeah. And definitely, if you had to rely on a missile defense system on its own, I would be very nervous about using that system because it doesn't seem to work well enough to rely on. But of course, you don't rely on it on its own. If you've knocked out the vast majority of your adversary's capabilities with an offensive strike, including precision-guided missile technology and hypersonics, anti-submarine capabilities, anti-satellite capabilities, cyber attacks, if you've done all of that, then the missile defense system only has to defend against whatever's left. And they've only got 3 missiles left. I'll take my chances with the missile defense system. It looks pretty good, actually. The odds
Yeah,
suddenly go right up.
it's not about what the technology can do. It's about what it can do in relation to a strategy. Right?
Exactly. And
Yeah,
so we talk a bit in the article about the combinational logic of
yeah,
strategic non-nuclear
that's a
weapons.
good way to put it.
And that makes them different from nukes. Nukes work kind of just on their own.
Mhm.
You can amplify the effect of nukes using them in greater numbers or different types and so forth. But, the Harvard academic Graham Allison likes to say, one nuclear weapon will ruin your afternoon, right? And so there's something to that with nukes. They're kind of the great equalizer thing. Strategic non-nuclear weapons don't work in the same way.
Mhm.
But when you combine them, that's what makes a difference. And that's what we're seeing now. That's where we're seeing the development of strategic non-nuclear weapons across the board, across all of the either great or rising kind of would-be great powers. And they're all developing across all of the capabilities. No one yet has put all their eggs in the missile defense basket or the anti-satellite basket and said, look, all we really need is the best anti-satellite weapons in the world and that'll get us there. They're all hedging their bets and they're all developing across all the weapon systems. And that's now having effects in nuclear policy. So that's what we say the third nuclear age is one in which strategic non-nuclear weapons become as or perhaps even more important in driving nuclear policies, in nuclear postures, in nuclear numbers, the willingness or otherwise to engage in nuclear arms control, all of these things. You can't just worry about nukes anymore. You've got to worry about these other annoying weapons, these strategic non-nuclear weapons.
That's right. It's like there are new incentives and arguments to double down and triple down on all of these different kinds of capabilities and then folding them into new strategies. And what we're left as like analysts of the system, we're left in the position of like trying to make sense of like how sensible is it to go down any or all of these paths? Like what are the risks and consequences and trade-offs and such? And unfortunately, a lot of people in our business are they think they're in the business of advocacy on
Yeah,
behalf of these things, and that's kind of
exactly. Yeah.
So I would kind of like to, I guess I just gestured it, unpack the kinds of risks that are either being introduced or increasing as a result of strategic non-nuclear weapons becoming
Sure.
more prevalent. So, like, what are some potential consequences?
So the first thing to note, I want to say this so that I'm not a complete, Johnny Raincloud for the podcast listeners, that not all of these weapons technologies or these technologies more broadly, the supporting, the AI stuff, quantum computing and all the rest, it doesn't only have destabilizing impacts. Some of these technologies can actually help restabilize relationships. The example I like is, and I'm not going to even pretend that I understand how the technology works, right? But I'm told, and the basic logic of this works, that advances in quantum computing can increase encryption.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You can do clever things with quantum computing that makes sending encrypted signals, easier and makes them sort of harder to hack, as it were. If that's the case, you can restore confidence in a state's ability to, for example, communicate with its nuclear armed submarines that are out there at sea. That's a great thing because nuclear armed subs, are the kind of ultimate form of a survivable second strike or retaliatory capability because they're the hardest ones to find and compromise.
Yeah.
The oceans are big and it's easy to lose, your tail, those who are trying to find you out there in the oceans, right? So that's why states stick nuclear weapons on subs and say, get out to sea.
Yeah.
And so if advances in quantum computing help increase a state's confidence in the survivability of their nuclear armed submarines, that is a huge plus. That can restabilize. If states are going to have nuclear weapons, and I don't want them to, right? Also, when I talk about deterrence, some people think that I'm advocating, therefore, that we should exist and live in a world, survive in a world just on deterrence postures only forever. And I think that's unsustainable. I think humans and machines make errors, right? Our luck is going to run out at some point. The only smart move is to get to a nuclear disarmed world. It's unbelievably hard to do, but that's got to be the goal.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, on the way there, if states are going to continue to have nuclear weapons, I don't want them being nervous in a conflict. I don't like jumpy nuclear armed great powers in conflict with each other, right? So some of the weapons systems or supporting systems can actually be good. However, if we only focused on that, we would be being completely silly. And those who just want to do the kind of good news story that this is all a great development actually, and people are too negative about this stuff, are just a bit absurd. Most of the impacts of these weapons and their supporting systems currently are destabilizing. And it's mainly, as I said, in that combinational logic. It's the ability to find nuclear targets more easily and more accurately. It's the ability to hit them more accurately. And if you combine those two, that's really destabilizing, right? If all of a sudden I realize that you have a greater ability than I do to both find where my weapons are, and that your forces that you would use to hit them are more accurate, so you're going to have a greater confidence that you can take out my stuff in a first strike and do it. The idea is no one's really concerned about this happening as what we call a bolt out of the blue. No one thinks that whatever, the Russians are going to wake up on Tuesday or the Americans are going to wake up on Thursday and decide to strike another country's nuclear arsenal. Like, that's ridiculous and risky. However, in the middle of a shooting war in which your citizens are dying, in a naval warfare theater at sea, and the conflict is really escalating, and you're having discussions with your military advisor saying, gee, this could really escalate to the nuclear level, right? And they're saying, yeah, absolutely. We need to be really, really careful here. We're really worried that the other side are going to make a move. They've been moving their forces from here to there. They've been mating their warheads on missiles and things. They've been forward deploying bombers. We're really concerned they're going to come and hit us. And one of your advisors says, I tell you what, we also worked up this other plan where we think we can get all of their forces. And even if the bit of uncertainty that we have that we can't quite get all of them, the 5% that are left over, we're really confident that our missile defense system can defend against that. What if we gave you this plan and you didn't have to be the first actor since 1945 to use nuclear weapons in doing so? You'd think really hard about it, right? Of course you would. In fact, you would not be doing your job as president or prime minister or whatever if you didn't, because you'd be saying, no, might be too risky. Let's just keep sending our young people off to die just in case that doesn't work out. Of course you'll think about it. You're not constrained by the nuclear taboo. You don't have to be that first president or prime minister or whatever to cross the nuclear threshold since 1945. But you could deny your adversary, who you're in a shooting war with, from having the ability to nuke you off the face of the planet by using strategic non-nuclear capabilities. You'd have to think very carefully about doing it. Now, of course, the other side know that you would have to think very carefully about doing it. And so they start ensuring you don't get to that situation. They double the size of their nuclear capabilities so that you've got more targets to hit or whatever it is. And we're already seeing this play out. So last year there was the revelations about these new missile silos out in the desert in China.
Yeah.
That's not a surprise to me. I know most people are kind of running around either completely freaked out or saying, I told you they were evil and dastardly and they were planning this all along. I look at that and go, of course they are. It's literally what I would do if I was in Beijing. China has a relatively small nuclear arsenal, particularly compared to the US, particularly compared to what the US is developing. China too is developing these capabilities, right? Not the US on its own. There's no sort of bias or whatever in that regard, but just US power is real. It's a thing.
Yeah, China's obviously balancing. I mean, like minimum deterrence or whatever. Like the minimum has there's a new minimum. The minimum shifts depending on what's going on. Like,
and this is where this gets us back to that thing about in the first nuclear age. Where did arms racing come from? Well, where's the minimum, right?
Yeah.
What does parity look like? And so China kind of faces, as the US develops better sensing capabilities and better strike capabilities, it faces kind of two roughly. I mean, there's a few things you can do. You can harden missile silos a bit more so they might be able to withstand a strike. But the two easiest ways, or two most straightforward ways, is you develop better submarines, quieter submarines that are harder to find, or you just develop more missile silos. You just have more targets. You give the US more targets to hit just to raise that question mark in their head. Could you definitely get all of them? And they are trying to develop quieter submarines, but that's really hard and really expensive. Do you know what's not? These days, it's developing missiles. Do you know what's really not expensive? It's very inexpensive, is to just dig a missile silo that might have a missile in it. It doesn't even have to have a missile in it. You can do this thing called a shell game, where you build 300 new silos and you only need 100 missiles and you move them around. So at the point when the US is considering striking, you've got to be 100% sure which missile is and which one's just an empty hole and which one has a missile in it, right? So that's actually the cheapest way of doing it. You just make yourself a harder target to hit. So we're already seeing strategic non-nuclear weapons driving nuclear decision-making, including the increase in arsenals. And it's no coincidence that China's increasing the size of its arsenal, Pakistan's increasing the size of its arsenal, because India's developing capabilities too. Even the Brits these days are talking about basically reversing this trend from it's been ongoing for a number of years. They're talking about actually increasing the size of their arsenal again, because they're looking at what the Russians are developing. So we're seeing this play out already. So it drives arms racing. The other thing is entanglement or commingling, putting these things together. That your conventional or strategic non-nuclear capabilities often rely on the same, say, satellite systems as your nuclear capabilities. So the question becomes, if I knock out your satellites, and I'm only doing it because I don't want you to use these conventional missiles and be able to target me, I've also compromised your nuclear missiles too. And what do you have to
and if you're attacking our nuclear command and control,
right,
surely it's because you're about to launch a nuclear attack. So surely we got to go first, right?
Well, and you kind of hope that anyone who does that is going to have a better argument than that old US one we used to joke about on missile defense of like, no, trust us. We weren't trying to compromise your nuclear capabilities, just the conventional ones.
Everyone needs better arguments than are currently on the table.
Then just trust us. We're the good guys, right? Everyone thinks of themselves as the good guys. Come on.
That's the problem.
So they're the kind of major things that we worry about in terms of stabilization, that it pushes arms racing, both in nuclear and conventional terms, and that it makes nuclear armed states in a crisis less rather than more confident in the survivability of their forces. And that can push you into that kind of user logic, that if we think you're coming anyway and you're going to take out all our forces, well, then waiting is suicide, right? We may as well launch it first and at least try and stop you in your tracks, even if we think you will then retaliate and it'll, end up being a kind of a suicidal move. Well, waiting if you're coming to get me anyway is just as suicidal.
Yeah, I mean, you're increasing the risks of crisis and stability when you're increasing the advantages that accrue to going first.
To moving first, exactly. And it's literally crisis instability 101, right?
Yeah. And that's literally what's happening that's the great risk of all of these new capabilities when they merge together or they start to appear to policymakers as like the suite of toolkit that we're drawing on to decide what to do.
Yeah.
When they look at it as a totality, if they decide that this encourages them to go first or go early, to shift to the offense on some level, then that is by definition destabilizing.
That's a bad day.
Yeah.
Right?
And that's what we're supposed to be managing.
Exactly. It's what we're meant to be trying to avoid, but we kind of got out of the habit of doing so, right?
Yeah.
Why? Because we got into that whole second nuclear age malarkey and sort of thought of it in that term, to use a very colloquial Australian phrase. Apologies to non-Antipodean listeners, but look that one up. It'll be a fun little side project. The other thing to throw into the mix then, actually speaking of Antipodean states, is that the other difference here is that it's not just the nuclear armed states who are gaining some of these capabilities, these strategic non-nuclear ones. So the big players in this realm are the US and China and Russia and India, right? And they're all nuclear armed, and they're kind of the nuclear armed great powers or great powers in waiting or whatever. But if you think about it, states like Japan, like Australia, I mean, as part of the AUKUS agreement, Pillar 2 is all about these other forms of technology, not the nuclear powered submarines. Although even the nuclear powered subs, I mean, they are a form of anti-submarine warfare.
Yeah,
I really worry about what the mission or missions are for these nuclear powered subs, given that one that I can very easily imagine, and if I can, I'm pretty sure people in Beijing can, is to target and compromise China's nuclear armed subs that basically have to patrol in the South China Sea. Because of US alliances and capabilities up there, they've kind of locked up the north of the Pacific. You can't really get out through there, which makes the South China Sea utterly integral to China's second strike survivable capabilities. And if Australia is gaining a new defense capability in these nuclear powered subs to be able to insert itself in there and search for and hunt those subs, that makes me really nervous. I don't think that's a good thing, right? But also Pillar 2 of the AUKUS agreement has things like, Australia is already doing research with the US on hypersonic missile technology. And part of AUKUS is about increasing that.
Yeah.
So that means you'll have allies with some of these strategic non-nuclear weapons, these conventional capabilities that can be used to compromise an adversary's nuclear capabilities. that raises the prospect of having to run the Cuban Missile Crisis again, where the other smaller actors in play there really, really matter. And the Cuban Missile Crisis was a near-run thing and really difficult. And, thank God the particular leaders who were there at the time in both capitals were the ones who were there and all the rest, right? Running the Cuban Missile Crisis again isn't something I want to do in general. Having to do it in a more complex environment in which one of the allies does something really silly with one of these strategic non-nuclear capabilities in terms of deploying them somewhere at a particular moment or whatever it is even more complicated again. So in that sense, they kind of they complicate the picture because it's not just great powers involved, I guess. Capture that.
AUKUS, I mean, I'm guilty of this too. When I talk about AUKUS, the focus is always on the submarines. I don't know, maybe it's because of the price tag or something, but the missile dimension of the AUKUS agreement and the missile proliferation to Australia is, like, on the surface, it's by far the more destabilizing, if you want to think of it like that. It's not devoid of context or like
exactly.
It's not like China's innocent here, but
no, of course not. But it's also China doesn't act in a vacuum, right?
Yeah, like, I don't give a shit about who's at fault. I give a shit about what's going to happen as a result of what we're doing.
Right? The rights and wrongs of this are not going to matter on that afternoon.
Yeah.
When the balloon goes up, as people like to say, or when the mushroom cloud goes up, it's really not going to matter who started the race. The point is that you raced, right? Now, and again, that kind of more optimistic note is we shouldn't say that all of the AUKUS technology sharing stuff is only destabilizing in that regard. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that was mentioned, it's only been mentioned once in a kind of a throwaway press conference thing that the three AUKUS partners did, is they were talking about Pillar 2, talking about hypersonics, and they said they want to do more research into hypersonic missile technology, at which I say, steady on, are you sure? But also hypersonic defense, as in how to defend against hypersonic missiles. Yeah. I think that's exceedingly hard, but that is where I'd be putting
the technology is just not there. Yeah, like we can't really do hypersonic defense yet.
Well, that's right. You can't. I mean, that's the point of them, right?
Yeah.
That's what makes them so useful. But equally, that's a reason to research it, right?
Yeah.
So if you can nullify the impact of these things, that's how we might be able to regain stability. Also, part of that, I think it's the Pillar 2 stuff, is the quantum computing stuff. So again, if that was pushed towards not making our weapons systems more accurate and all the rest, but if it made it, if we could, as I was saying earlier, like better encryption of communications to nuclear armed submarines that can increase, say, US and British confidence in their nuclear armed submarines, that's a good thing in my book. So it's not that we shouldn't be doing technology cooperation. We need to be thinking about what are we cooperating on in what areas, and we have to be thinking about the stability and instability consequences of these things.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned arms racing as a risk of this new landscape.
Yeah.
And in some ways, I think the technical definition of arms racing, or like the classical definition, narrow definition of arms racing, is kind of unhelpful because I mean, we have to keep it in view, but it really downplays every other kind of competitive arms buildup.
Correct.
And so
and there's that whole do you know that the Buzan and Herring book, which is the thing that we often go to if you want to do the really tight definition that you want to put on like a lecture slide when you're trying to distinguish between arms racing and non-arms racing, right? And they talk about the arms. The book is called The Arms Dynamic. And they say that actually most of what gets talked about as arms racing is what we, us clever academics who've got this little concept over here that no one but other academics are ever going to realize, we call that the arms dynamic, where states try to match each other, right? So you arm yourself with something and I think, hell's bells, I better get the same just so Van doesn't have the ability to attack me on Tuesday afternoon when he hasn't had his third coffee or whatever, right? And so I gain those capabilities, and all we're doing is trying to match parity with each other. And they said the difference between arms racing is parity isn't the goal. The goal is getting one up on the other side, is going beyond, because you're always trying to get the advantage. So when I build, like say you build your, whatever it is, your 3 hypersonics, and I say, well, I'm going to build 3 hypersonics too. And you say, cool, I'm going to build 5 because you're always trying to keep that edge on me, right? So I said, well, in that case, I'm building 7. That's what an arms race is, where there kind of isn't a logical end to it. You're both trying to get advantages over the other, whereas the arms dynamic is the search for parity. There is an end. There's a minimum deterrent. You get to a point, and we kind of got there during the Cold War and then kept arms racing anyway for all sorts of perverse domestic reasons. But it is actually possible to find a degree of, I think, it's possible to find a degree of stability with these weapon systems and at that sort of minimum level. And that's not perfect. As I said, it's still dangerous. We should be working to get rid of them, all the rest. But the search for parity is better than arms racing.
Yeah, I mean there's a couple thoughts here. One is like arms racing has a clear um, color or connotation that that brings out the sense of danger that's implied in the concept.
Yep.
Arms dynamic does the opposite, unfortunately, because it sounds like
Well, it's all fun,
international
right?
relations. It's arms relations, you
Yeah,
know, like
yeah. It's
and
kind of too benign, right? Like,
yeah. And so that's troubling.
Yeah, and I mean, the way to think about these things, I think, particularly in Asia, there's some really, really bad analysis around this stuff that basically forgets what the starting point for all this is. The only way to think about relative arms competition, whether it's racing, the dynamic, whatever, is you've got to have an accurate starting point, right? So we look at what China's doing in terms of building up, and I talked about the increase in China's nuclear capabilities. And like, I'm not a fan of it. I don't love it. I'd rather not see states increasing rather than that kind of secular trend that we did have of decreasing nuclear numbers. That is a safer world when the numbers are going down, right? But equally, it doesn't come out of nowhere, right? The US and the Russians have kind of stopped reducing. They've gotten rid of all of the old arms control treaties, the strategic arms control treaties that we had during the first nuclear age to try and put limits on this stuff. That's part of the interaction between deterrence and arms control, right? That when you opt into an arms control agreement, you're signaling to the other side that I am willing to restrain myself. It has to be mutual. We don't trust each other. We're going to have mutual inspections. We're going to verify it. But I buy the idea of restraint. I will do it if you do it as well, right? And if you get rid of arms control, you're basically saying, nope, all bets are off. There is no restraint. I will match you weapon for weapon. And perhaps I might even go beyond that and try and get an advantage because I don't like you or whatever it is, right? So the starting point in Asia, of course, is that there is an extra regional power that is the militarily dominant player. It's the US, right? So when China's arming itself, the idea that we can only look at what China's doing sort of in a vacuum is kind of absurd. Like, you're not going to put that relative to the United States.
Yeah.
Pretend that the US isn't a factor here. I mean, that's silly, right?
That's what's reassuring. Like, I don't like Chinese nukes.
Out, right?
Yeah. I'm not interested in Chinese nukes, obviously, but seeing them modernize in this way, it's not alarming to me. It's reassuring to me in the sense that, like, oh, they are irrational.
Yeah.
Like they're perceiving their environment correctly.
Yep.
And they're trying to take measures to guard against it. Like, there's not evidence in any of this nuclear modernization stuff on China's side that they're shifting to like a first strike posture.
No.
If anything, they're making it more survive. Yeah. Like
they're literally making themselves a harder target and developing. There's been some recent stuff just come out about this last day or so on increases in, or at least China's attempts to increase its early warning capabilities that have been pretty poor up until now.
Yeah.
When a state increases its capability to detect an incoming strike, its early warning capabilities, that means it's genuinely concerned about others. What does it need warning from? Warning of. It's concerned about attacks, right?
The Director of National Intelligence Threat Assessment this year, just out, it said that it judged that China is more worried now about a U.S. first strike.
Yep.
And so it's trying to take countermeasures to reduce the likelihood of an American first strike on them. If that's what's going on, that's a fucking security dilemma, man.
Yeah, of course they are. Because they're not morons, right?
Yeah.
We shouldn't think that they are, and they're acting accordingly. Like, none of it's terribly surprising to me. I'm maybe slightly less heartened than you are, I guess. Like, I guess I'm heartened.
It's not a good situation. It's just it means
that
there's
depressing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's depressing, but it's not concerning in that regard. But what is concerning is if you're a disingenuous analyst or politician or journalist or whatever it is, who just pretends that US military power either isn't real, isn't a thing, or is in any and all circumstances benign, and anyone who doesn't see it as
our nukes are good, baby. Yeah.
is, a bad guy. What that does is creates a climate in which we can have discussions between otherwise sensible, well-informed people who at least have half a brain, right? Who look at China in a vacuum and say, look at what they're doing. I mean, look at the numbers. They speak for themselves. And like, No, they don't. Nothing speaks for itself. If you look at them compared to US numbers, it looks pretty logical, right? And so
Yeah.
it's so important to do that kind of comparative analysis, right? To not look at things in a vacuum. And it's the same with the US, right? The US didn't do this stuff, didn't develop these capabilities because they felt like it. And yes, of course, there's some domestic stuff there, the military industrial complex, someone wants to make a buck. So, those incentives are there as well. But the US, like any other state, has security concerns as well. It too feels the security dilemma, right? Like these things continue to work into each other, which means that what we need comes all the way back to that original point about security dilemma sensibility. That's how you put the brakes on these things. You've got to understand that your own actions are actually part of the problem here, and that you have the ability to sort of get off the train, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, the reason it matters to acknowledge a security dilemma sensibility or to detect one when that's what's going on is because it directs you to how to resolve the situation or manage the situation optimally. Like
Yeah, exactly.
it's a way of identifying like, okay, this universe of policies might help the situation, generally in the form of like restraint or communication of some kind.
Yep.
And then these other kinds of policies are assured to make things worse.
They have to take us down a worse path.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So on this thread of the arms racing, arms dynamic thing, we didn't exactly mention it, but like as part of arms dynamic, which waters down what we're talking about a little bit, but the arms competition can take the form of like you shift racing into different categories of weapons.
Yeah.
Whereas with arms racing, it was always like nuke to nuke kind of thing.
Exactly. And that's what's different this time. That's one of the things that Drew Futter and I sort of argue in this article, and we're kind of arguing as part of this larger project around what is a third nuclear age, is that arms racing itself is more complex. In fact, I published a piece on this a few years ago in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist that was basically making this argument. That
I was just about to ask you about that.
hey, never wait for an author to not self-promote their own work.
Perhaps you've heard. Yeah, no, it's good. This is
happens, man. I published something on it. But
so
the central argument of that is that like we do appear to be set for a new era of arms racing. This is going to be this appears to be, depressingly, at least the early signs are pushing in this direction. One of the hallmarks of the third nuclear age is we're back to good old-fashioned arms racing, but it's not quite old-fashioned arms racing. It's not the arms racing that your granddaddy knew, right? Like it has a different flavor this time because it's spread across both nuclear and strategic non-nuclear capabilities. So if you look at the role of at least so far, the US is actually a pretty good example of this. India, to a lesser extent, too, actually. They both have been developing capabilities that have been helping to drive nuclear arms racing. The US does stuff that China responds to. India does stuff that Pakistan responds to. But neither of them are really doing it with their nuclear capabilities. It's with their non-nuclear capabilities that are really driving this.
Yeah.
And that is relatively new. I mean, it was kind of there to an extent in the first nuclear age. I mean, as I said, that's why we banned missile defenses, right? But we were better attuned to it. And the way it played out was in the first nuclear age is that we realized that is a game we really don't want to play, and this could make the nuclear arms race even worse. And in the third nuclear age, there seems to be no recognition of that whatsoever. And the only response is, well, they got them, so we got them, right?
Yeah. We're not really expanding our nuclear arsenal in the sense of we're trying to hit 2,000 warheads or something like that.
Yeah.
It's we're increasing survivability and lethality, and
exactly
that's what actually matters.
But we do risk getting to a point where we may see that playing out, right? That actually states get to a point where they look at the others who are responding. They don't recognize the security dilemma. They have no security dilemma sensibility, right? They just see them as inherently hostile, and all the capabilities they're developing must be for hostile intent. And they say, well, I will certainly keep developing these strategic non-nuclear weapons, but actually also I can respond in kind with my nukes as well, right?
It's the pathology of gaps, like missile gaps. It's the fucking like.
Right. Well, the new one is the hypersonic one, right?
Yep.
Like the
weather balloon gaps, fucking
high level, very clever American decision makers running around saying we're falling behind the Russians and the Chinese.
Yeah.
I'm sitting there thinking, you know why the Russians and the Chinese developed them, right? Because of your missile defense system. So now if you develop hypersonics to not fall behind, well, then they'll have to do it too. And it's this thing, the kind of fancy academic term for this is what we call the fallacy of the last move.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think of it like in chess, that, like you've got this last move that, aha, I got you. And that the other side's just going to go, damn it.
Yeah.
We were so in that race, but then they won. Oh, well, I guess we'll just give up and be utterly vulnerable to their whims. And that's, again, like that's not world politics. It's not how it works. The other side always come back with countermeasures because they kind of have to, right?
Otherwise, the most generous thing you could say is like it's checkers in a world of chess, but like even that is over intellectualizing.
Exactly. Yeah. It's just kind of just not using your brain, really.
Yeah. So if I wanted to get your thoughts on like polarity, and I'm really wary that this is going to get too wonky. So like,
let's try and keep it
thin.
I'm wonky. Let's do this. We can do this.
So like system polarity, I don't think is a way of talking about the distribution of military power in the world, basically. I don't find it a super powerful analytical concept, but there are some questions that it brings out that I like, that are salient questions, I guess. So I just want to hit these and then react to any or all of them, however you want. One, do nuclear weapons give great powers the status of being a great power? Is like, how much do nuclear weapons play in great power status? Two, how can the international system be unipolar, nuclear unipolar, but nuclear multipolar? Three, do you see a problem with pursuing primacy or unipolarity in a multipolar world?
Cool. Okay, let's see if I can do it. And your timing is impeccable. I'm putting the finishing touches on a book manuscript that's coming out hopefully early next year on just this topic. So let's try and not geek out on this too much. So first one, I should say as well, I'm going to throw in, I too have problems with polarity as I have fewer problems with polarity as an analytical concept, in the sense that the thing that guides me on this all the time is that policymakers themselves use the concept and understand the world in reference to it. So all the clever academic reasons for saying, well, but polarity isn't real, and actually the world's different now, I say that's terrific. Look at these policymakers out there making policies, doing the stuff that we're trying to analyze and understand, and rightly or wrongly, they are using polarity as their ordering concept. So we don't get the choice to.
Yeah, it's totally a real concept. It's like, the implications of it, you can't squeeze much out of it in my mind.
Yeah. So the question on how do you get there is nuclear weapons. Does nuclear weapons equal great power status? I think the short answer is no, unless we're going to treat North Korea.
Are you telling me North Korea is not a great power?
and like North Korea is the easy go-to. I mean, Israel too, right? No one treats Israel as a great power. Like they're an important regional player, but no one thinks of them, in the various lists of the poles of power that make up our new multipolar order. Israel is never on there, right? Mm-hmm. Neither is North Korea, neither is Pakistan, right? So clearly having nuclear weapons doesn't give you automatic great power status, but it does seem to play some kind of role in helping to. And the key to understanding this, I think, I'm going to try and do this in a nutshell. It's effectively the argument of the book. Polarity is a perceptual phenomenon. So as soon as we try and define polarity with reference to some particular list of material capabilities, we've made a category error because it ain't what it is. So when we say polarity refers to the distribution of capabilities across the system, I put the hand up and be the annoying guy at the back of the room saying, no, it doesn't. It really doesn't. Look at how it's used in the world all the time. People contradict each other. Some people talk about a multipolar world, and then others talk about how the US and China are at the heart of everything, and they're the two most important actors, whether they realize it or not. They're talking about a bipolar world. And others, again, still talk about a unipolar world. And if you crunch the numbers on just about all the capabilities, actually it comes out as unipolar. Yet we have no way of understanding why everyone's talking about multipolarity and acting, and this is the really important part, acting as if we're in a multipolar world, bring it into existence. It's a bit like those nuclear ages, right? You think in those terms, you act in those terms, for all intents and purposes, it's real. You can't understand that if you only define polarity in material capability terms.
When you're thinking as military power, that's
military,
when
economics,
you get,
resources,
it's obviously
populations.
an extreme concentration of.
Yeah, so everyone has their pet list, right? And clearly military capabilities are important, but it's not the deciding factor. The reason being polarity refers to the number of actors, doesn't even have to be states in principle, but these days it tends to be nation states, that are conferred with the status of great power. And status is a social phenomenon. It's conferred on you by others, right? And it's conferred on you for the reasons that they want to confer it on you. They might be real number crunchers. So they might say, yep, I've crunched the numbers and therefore it's a unipolar or whatever. Often they're not.
It's based on images and stuff, yeah.
Right. I mean, perceptions, as we know from decades of research, are based on all sorts of things. Some of it's rational, some of it's irrational, whatever. It doesn't really matter, right? The outcome is the thing that matters. So nuclear weapons seem to play some important role, though, because there is a bit of a sense that the big players have nukes. This is a really interesting policy question for Brazil. Because if Brazil reaches or if Brazil is successful in being conferred with great power status at some point in the future, and it hasn't gained nuclear weapons, it hasn't, opted out of the NPT under Article 10 and said, sorry guys, loved all this, but we're off to be a great power now, which means we're going to need to go get some nukes. If it hasn't done that, that'll make it the first great power since 1945 to not have nuclear weapons. What an interesting idea, right? Like, so they're kind of the test case. Brazil will be the test case. Now, that doesn't mean if Brazil doesn't get conferred with great power status, it'll be because they didn't have nukes, right? But we can say quite for sure that if they do, if Brazil becomes treated as one of the poles of power in the international system and it hasn't got nukes, that tells us that nuclear weapons actually weren't even a necessary condition. At this stage, we can say we can do that classic academic thing. It's probably a necessary but not sufficient condition for achieving that status. But Brazil is going to be the big test case on that. So that was nukes. The middle question was, you're stretching my memory here, Van. What was your second question?
What was the second question? Oh, how can the international system be unipolar but nuclear multipolar?
Yeah,
And
so this is
down
tricky,
to how you measure
right?
this shit, obviously.
Yeah. Also, and I guess it gets back to the same answer in a way. It depends on how you measure polarity, and if you're measuring it in the way that it actually works out in the real world, you're not measuring it with any one material capability, right? But this happens quite a lot. So one of the arguments that, or one of the ways of conceiving this that we're looking at now in this project run out of the University of Leicester on the third nuclear age, shout out to the third nuclear age dudes, is we're looking at how to get because the phrasing really matters here. Yeah, it's a nuclear armed multipolar order. Not nuclear multipolarity in the sense that not multiple nuclear armed states, because we've had that since 1952 when the British tested here in Australia, actually. As soon as Britain had nuclear weapons, there were 3, which makes it multipolar if you're going to count, if the poles are just those who have nuclear weapons, right? So, but of course, it was a bipolar distribution of power and status that ran all the way through. So other states got nuclear weapons, but they just didn't tend to matter that much. It was the central balance that really mattered, right? Because of the role of polarity as this kind of overarching distribution of power and status. Now, for the first time, we're approaching, I think, at least an order that people seem to perceive, rightly or wrongly, and it doesn't matter if they're wrong, rightly or wrongly, as a multipolar order, where you've got sort of the US and China and a kind of re-emerged Russia, at least for now, probably India, if not already some stage in the future, maybe one or two others further down the track, whatever. But a multipolar distribution of power in a nuclear armed world. And that is fundamentally different. That's another hallmark of the third nuclear age. I mean, in polarity terms, thinking about the distribution of power, the number of either super or great powers, the 3 ages, the first, second, and third nuclear age, actually map on, and it's not a coincidence, they map quite nicely onto bipolarity, unipolarity, multipolarity. And that, yeah, as I said, that's not a coincidence, right? The distribution of power drives thinking and threat perceptions, and therefore the capabilities you build and all the rest.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of an interesting, is probably the optimistic way of putting it, perhaps potentially quite dangerous era, in which you've got multiple actors acting as these kind of poles of power in the international system, and they're all thus far nuclear armed, right? The US, China, Russia, India, they're all going to be nuclear armed poles. So we've got to figure out, what does stability look like? What does arms control look like? All of these things in an era. What does restraint more broadly look like? What do confidence building measures look like in a nuclear armed multipolar order? And there's lots of work to be done there.
Yeah. There's also this side question. It's a little askew of what we're talking about, but the kind of the distribution of power, or how an international order distributes power.
Yeah.
Because like it's possible to de-link the system polarity from configuration of international order, and this becomes really relevant on like the transnational left, global left kind of conversations, because there's a tendency for like anti-imperialists to view multipolarity as like normatively desirable, something we should actively be trying to build.
Yep.
And it's like, well, if this is just a description of the landscape and it involves acquiring nukes, this is not a terrain you can do anything about. You have to work within the terrain.
And also, let's not pretend that's not still fairly imperial. We're still talking about a tiny handful of states being disproportionately influential compared to the entirety of the rest of the world, right? Just because there's more of them doesn't make it any more egalitarian in that regard.
Yes, like that's the thing. Like equilibrium or balance does not mean egalitarianism.
Exactly.
I mean, like those are very.
But there is, it's interesting, right? So there's a couple of arguments in favor of multipolarity, which are always weird arguments, because it plays into my arguments. Part of how I get there on terms of like, that's why we know polarity does not refer to the objectively quantified distribution of capabilities. Because in that case, the idea of creating a multipolar world, or what's often referred to as multipolarization, it's what the Russians and even the French and others have talked about for years.
Yeah.
Well, that's ridiculous. The capabilities will sort this out, right? Like the stuff is out there. We just need to count it, and from there we work out what polarity is. You can't create polarity by wanting it, right?
Yeah.
But they think and act in this way, and so you're like, you know what? Maybe polarity needs to be defined differently. So there's a couple of reasons why states do it. One is that, or why actors do it. One is that kind of anti-imperial argument, and that in anti-imperialist terms, it doesn't add up to me for those reasons.
Yeah, same.
It still looks like imperialism, and like great powers are conferred with special rights and special responsibilities. We talk a lot about special responsibilities, but special rights, that means treating some states as more equal than others. That doesn't feel very anti-imperial to me. Others who are
multipolarity can be hierarchical, I guess, would be.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So others who are not necessarily making a kind of a left argument, but because you can make a kind of a small c conservative argument about balance, right? That a multipolar system is just more stable and less dangerous because it's much easier to balance against preponderance of power.
Yeah.
And we don't have to get into the depths of the old Cold War IR debates about whether multipolar systems or bipolar systems are more or less stable or whatever. I mean, that's kind of related to this stuff. But basically, if you like balance, the one thing you don't like is unipolarity.
Yes.
Because unipolarity, by definition, is an unbalanced international order. And so the rise of new powers, if you're into balance, if you look at the history of great power politics and say, look, it's all pretty awful, but the least awful parts are when power has been able to be checked by others. You know, anti-hegemonial coalitions, like the coalition that put down Napoleonic France and put down Nazi Germany, Imperial Germany and Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. I'd rather have them than not, rather than being a unipolar system where Imperial Japan or Nazi Germany or Napoleonic France is the unipole. That's scary, right? So if you're into balance, if you think it has some role to play, multipolarity is generally a good thing. But this gets to your last question, the third one there, because there's a lot of talk currently, particularly in the West and particularly my own country in Australia, about kind of welcoming a balance of power in the region particularly, but in the world more broadly, which is, I can never quite work out whether it's disingenuous or they just haven't really thought through it, because then everything we do is to ensure that a balance of power doesn't come about.
Yeah, we're trying to escape a balance.
Escape a balance, because a balance of power, say in Asia, means that you let China get more powerful vis-a-vis the Americans, who project themselves in. They're not in Asia, right? There's a great big ocean in between. Indo-PACOM exists for a reason, right? The rest of the states of Asia don't have, Asian Command or Indo-PACOM Command. They
military
just have the
viceroys.
Yeah, they just have the Navy because they're in Asia, right?
Yeah.
The US has CENTCOM to get into the Middle East and AFRICOM to get into Africa and Indo-PACOM to get into the if you want to call it the Indo-Pacific, which is a sort of an absurd term in my view, but into Asia, right? So because an extra regional power is the militarily dominant player in Asia and has been for decades, to create balance in Asia, you kind of need China, or you need someone to rise. It doesn't have to be China, right? You can say, look, they're a authoritarian one-party communist state. I don't want it to be that state. I'm cool with that. I don't like authoritarian one-party states either. But it needs to be someone has to be able to balance US power then, if balance is what you're after. By definition, otherwise we have an unbalanced. Now, an unbalanced distribution of power in Asia for US allies like Australia has been wonderful. It's been terrific because our mate was the one that sat atop the pile, right? That was
the unipole that's doing all the wars in the periphery.
Yeah, right. If there's going to be an imbalance, you want it to be your mate who is the imbalanced or the disproportionately powerful actor. But if you are serious about a balance of power, if you think that's where stability comes from, well, then you need those power differentials to even up. And what I see, for example, in the Australian debate is as soon as China starts doing that, we freak out. Look at China's arms racing. It's being assertive and look at all that stuff. We must match them weapon for weapon or we'll be in trouble. I'm kind of like, do you not think that the US, why are you treating the Americans with such little respect here? I really respect the American military. I take it very seriously. It's the big guy in the room that just to begin with. So there's this kind of weird thing where searching, and look, a lot of this comes from, I don't think people are necessarily being disingenuous. I think they just haven't really thought very carefully about it because they say it's like a nice thing to say. We seek a balance of power in Asia. We seek a balance of power in the world. No, you don't. Actually, you seek primacy. And the US is very clear on this, actually, admirably clear in policy documents, that it seeks to preserve its position in Asia, which is one of primacy. And it's had this thing about not having peer competitors as a strategic goal in official documents. It doesn't hide it away. It's not
it's not secret shit.
It says openly, we seek a world without peer competitors. That is an unbalanced order by definition.
Yeah.
If you don't have peer competitors, that means no one is as powerful as you are, right? That means you are searching for primacy. Now, you asked, is it smart to do so when the world appears to be becoming multipolar? And this is where I risk undermining everything I was saying about polarity being in the mind, and it's not just the distribution of capabilities. But as I said, look, capabilities matter, right? And China is getting more powerful, whether we like it or not, relative to the US. Russia, and I'm going to assume, don't want to speak for everyone, I'm assuming most of us would prefer Russia, particularly what it's doing with its power right now, wasn't half as powerful as it is. But Russia is a state that we just sort of can't get past either. Right? They're still despite the total disaster, really, of the dreadful, illegal, immoral war against the people of Ukraine. It is still a militarily significant actor and a politically significant actor for all sorts of reasons. I think its conventional military performance in Ukraine is undermining this, actually. I think it's going to take a hit in those kind of perceptual, conferring status terms, but it still has the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. It still has a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, all these things, right? So the world appears to be multipolar. Most states seem to be acting as if it is. So to try and seek primacy there, I think is a recipe for war. I mean, unless you're going to bet the house that ultimately all these growth projections, at least for China, if not India, are misplaced. And there's people who make that argument, right? There's always someone telling you that China's going to collapse next week. And I always kind of think, but isn't that convenient? And arguments that are so convenient should be treated with a high degree of skepticism, right? That we're all going to wake up and it's just a bad dream. We can go back to the unipolar moment. Phew, it's all over. All that rise of the rest rubbish. Yeah. So unless you think that's the case, if you're planning to try and preserve primacy, you're saying, I'm willing to do so with resistance by a nuclear-armed great power in the form of China, who has every reason to not have the US being the dominant power in its own backyard. I mean, the US literally maintains around 80,000 military personnel less than a day's flight from the Chinese mainland. China doesn't maintain that in, say, Latin America. It is an imbalance of power in their kind of respective positions, right? If you're going to try and maintain that and think that the Chinese are just going to go, oh, well, that's a pity. Damn it. We thought we'd have, our moment in the sun, but actually the Americans got here first and they managed to hold on to their primacy. I don't buy it. I think they will fight you for it. And I don't think that's a fight worth having, because I think major power war is the disaster we should be trying to avoid all the time, not least because of the possibilities of it going nuclear.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the themes of the Pacific Power Paradox book over my shoulder.
Nicely positioned there in the back for those who are watching the video, right?
Yeah. I mean, the primacy, yeah, like it's, even if you relax what you think of as like distributions of power, so it's not just strictly military considerations, even if it's like symbolic distributions of power or something, like we're still talking about a lot of like resistance, counter pressure, counterbalancing. And so like the idea that you're going to push forward with primacy in an environment where you don't have, where you're not like the unipole in the way that you were in the 90s. It assumes that everyone's on your agenda, except you're having to go around and coerce everyone to comply with your agenda. And that's how you're using all your political capital. Like, it's obviously
ask whether it's worth the candle, right? Like,
yes.
When the stakes are that high. I mean, if it was just like, it was kind of easier in the unipolar era, right? Because you try and give yourself the best possible position. Why not? And at kind of what cost? There was no one to seriously challenge your position. So give it a crack. Why not? Now there is. So the stakes are really radically different, right? And it's funny, you know, there's the kind of the restraint crowd who make a lot of these sorts of arguments, right? So these kind of arguments that we're making, the kind of anti-primacy arguments, are often labeled as, oh, that's a kind of a restrainer argument. There is a bit of a division within the restraint crowd. Some would agree with this entirely, to say seeking primacy of any kind is a fool's errand and is unnecessarily dangerous. We can still be powerful, particularly in our own neck of the woods, but that's all we need to do. And we just have to reconcile ourselves now with being one of the poles in a multipolar balance of power order, right? But actually lots of the restraint crowd are arguing for restraint in certain regions, like, and basically withdrawing from the Middle East, withdrawing from Europe, because the real game now is in Asia, because that's where the main challenger in the form of China is. And again, openly stated goal that they think the US should be pursuing here is making sure that no other great power is as secure as the US is at home. Because as soon as everyone's equally secure at home, you can basically engage in nefarious activities in other great powers' backyards. So if China is secure in Asia, have a free hand basically to kind of meddle in US power in the Western Hemisphere. And you can do that with each of the great powers, right?
The reactionary version of restraint is primacy.
It's still
but it's clear-eyed that primacy is indexed against the next greatest power,
primacy,
which is China.
It's not trying to keep down regional powers and regions that don't particularly matter all that much to you right now. It's saying Asia is what really matters. That's where we have to seek primacy. It's saying you will be the only great power that will be fully secure at home. That makes you first among equals. That is a form of primacy. And so my argument is it's kind of realism, but not all the way down. There's kind of a limit where they hit this, like, oh, I still have this utopian dream of actually being the most powerful. I'm like, be a proper realist. A proper realist realizes that power is real. You don't always get to control it. And the best you can do is manage it, right? And you manage it with prudence and all those kind of classic realist ideas. And that means the US basically accepting that it might not be able to maintain all those allies and partners and friends in the same way that it has for decades in Asia. It might not get to maintain the same military presence in Asia. It might have to, retrench a bit. It doesn't mean deserting Asia completely. It doesn't mean just giving,
there's a whole universe of strategies that are possible other than primacy.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
You can't get there if you don't explore
it. It's set up in this way, right? It's either primacy or you are just a appeasing rollover, you're just giving up on everything. And it's like, that's ridiculous.
Yeah. I mean, that was my whole, the progressive foreign policy thing I had in security studies. The whole shtick there, well, there was many things going on, but one of them was that if you just take the progressive movement alone in the US, just within that cross-section of the electorate,
right,
we can tease out 3 full-blown grand strategies, all of which are alternatives to primacy.
Yeah.
And that's just with that progressive movement. There's still all these other, you can do the same thing with reactionary politics or whatever.
Well, it's funny. So this kind of anti-primacy argument, to my mind, is a small c conservative argument. Like, I think you can make it
Mm.
for progressive reasons as well. I think
Yeah.
you can perfectly well make it for conservative reasons. So if you, like, dear listeners, if you find yourself on the conservative side of politics, and when people talk about progressives and whatever, it kind of brings you out in a rash, you don't have to seek primacy in foreign policy. You can still be a conservative. In fact, I think an anti-hegemonial,
Classic.
goal.
I mean, that's like the old school.
It's Edmund Burke, right? It's classic
yeah.
conservatism. It's just that you have to apply that to yourself as well. Sorry,
Mhm.
you also can't seek primacy.
That's the Reinhold Niebuhr. Like, you have to look yourself in the mirror and be
Right.
able to see. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a couple more questions.
Sure.
There's like maybe two more. So
I mean, if there is a single listener left by this stage,
I know.
We'll find a prize.
God
We'll
bless
give you
all
a
of
free
you.
copy of Van's new book.
Yeah. So when I worked in the Pentagon, one of my biggest problems working Korea issues was trying to reassure South Korea and Japan with extended deterrence promises.
Right.
Like, we extend our nuclear weapon. We promise that we're going to nuke somebody if they nuke you.
Yeah.
So it's like nuclear deterrence on their behalf, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. So for Korea and Japan, the nuclear umbrella promise became like this fetish object. And then I moved over to defense strategy, away from the Northeast Asia stuff. And I started doing all this future of warfare work.
Yeah.
And in that space, nobody ever talked about nukes, man.
Coin all the way, right?
The future of warfare was missiles, drones, directed energy weapons, sometimes human augmentation stuff,
Right.
But like, the thing was, like, cyber and the cyborg stuff never really affected the balance of power when we were thinking about it. So it was always discounted.
Yeah. And it's always like against kind of small actors and things, right? Like,
yeah.
In that great power sense. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, anyway, the future of warfare crowd, like,
interesting.
They thought nukes were obsolete, sort of, but they were not disarmament advocates. Like, obviously, very far from it.
Yeah.
It's just that, like, they kind of tacitly accepted the nuclear revolution as like valid, but overtaken by the precision guided munition revolution in a sense.
They kind of accept the nuclear revolution, but almost take it through to its logical conclusion, right? Where they basically say, therefore, nukes are effectively irrelevant.
Yes, so the way around the impasse is conventional munitions.
Kind of make sure the other side know that they'll go off how they meant to go off in the event of it happening, but otherwise there is no politics here. There's nothing to talk about, sort of thing, right? So it's really interesting, right? Because you got the ally part of this and the whole. Because there's a question I get asked this a lot on the kind of strategic non-nuclear side of, is the end result of this is where we're sort of headed towards, not next year, no one's arguing that, but, in 40, 50 years, that nuclear weapons effectively become obsolete, that strategic non-nuclear weapons kind of replace them, basically.
Or for the purposes of extended deterrence in particular.
So I'm skeptical. I think it's possible. And in fact, there's a very good Australian strategist, Rod Lyon, who kind of needles me on this stuff and says, look, I get it. You're right. These strategic non-nuclear weapons can be destabilizing, can be dangerous, got to manage it. But, look, if we're going to get a nuclear disarmed world that people say they want, like, this is how we get there, right? These are going to have to be the alternatives. And I think that's plausible. It's right. But we've got to work out how we get there in the meantime. If they raise the risks of nuclear war in the meantime, that's not how we get to a disarmed world, for sure. So it's interesting on the Allied stuff. That a rough guess, were you in the Pentagon doing the Allied stuff in the kind of 2010s?
Yeah.
So, because you remember the 2010 nuclear posture review in the US?
Yeah.
Its big message was it was trying to downplay the role of nuclear weapons in the overall US defense posture.
Yes. So I was part of that. And that statement was reflecting the statement that they're trying to diminish the role of nukes, the salience, even as we were like doubling down on extended nuclear deterrence with allies. That was born of this kind of tension.
Right. And
because it's like what the allies say they want, basically.
Exactly. And so the way that it was phrased in the posture review, actually at the time, Drew Futter and I, we wrote our first article in this area. So it was our first kind of dipping the toe into the area exactly on this, where we argued that the Obama plan for a nuclear disarmed world, while admirable, it's the right goal, his path to getting there is going to be a path that the US will travel alone, which is like a facetious way of saying it ain't going to work. Because the path to doing so was via these strategic non-nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
And at the time, particularly, but even still now, the US, in conventional terms, is the most impressive military actor. So if your path to getting to a world without nukes is to make yourself even more disproportionately powerful in conventional terms, wait for the others to not join you in that. Nuclear weapons still have that great equalizer effect. All you're doing is saying to the Russians and the Chinese, your nuclear disarm world doesn't look that good, because we get to the end point and the Americans are armed to the teeth with precision strike munitions and these amazing anti-satellite capabilities and amazing satellite reconnaissance capability and all these things. And what we did in return was just get rid of our nukes, the one thing that can overcome it all. So the great equalizer effect of nuclear weapons, I think, still exists. The reality is, thus far, even with, this is the concern, right, that a combined use of strategic non-nuclear weapons might be thinkable as a first strike against nuclear capabilities. No one's saying that that's not a huge risk. So no one pretends that anyone's seriously contemplating doing that next week, right? But it's the threat of someone being able to do that in the future that's driving arms acquisitions today. That's how it drives. It's the future threat of it, right? Because are you really going to want to be that advisor who said, you're let's say the Russian advisor who said to President Putin, no, I looked at the US capabilities and they won't be able to do it. And Putin said, are you sure? Yeah, it's good. Their missile defense system's rubbish, and they love the hypersonic stuff, but they're not that good, and whatever. And then on that Thursday afternoon when you got it wrong, because you said, no, I'm sure, right? And you said to Putin, you didn't need to put a little bit away for a rainy day, right? So that's what drives these dynamics now. So I don't think these weapons are going to replace nukes. In many ways, that's unfortunate, right? Because nothing is as indiscriminately and massively destructive as a nuclear weapon. So actually a world of, and at the end of the article from a few years ago on the third nuclear age, we outlined 4 potential scenarios. And the last one, which we say is the least plausible, but it's possible, is actually that these strategic non-nuclear weapons develop in ways that we can't foresee yet, which basically make nuclear weapons obsolescent. They just, they even out.
Yeah.
You don't need nukes anymore. We say that's possible, and it becomes a route to a disarmed world. And that, I think, is actually a safer. It's not a safe world. Still plenty of war and conflict and all the rest can go on. Civilians will still die in wars using strategic non-nuclear weapons and all the rest, but it's a safer world than a nuclear armed world, I think. And that's an entirely debatable, somewhat controversial position, and I'm very happy to be persuaded otherwise from that. I'm not kind of welded on to that, you know what I mean? But I'm pretty damn sure I'd prefer that. But the argument is that that doesn't have to be the path to a disarmed world. There are smarter ways to get there. What's interesting with allies is their initial reaction to the 2010 posture review, when the US was like, we're going to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in our overall defense posture, and how we get there is through these new conventional capabilities. As you will well know, then that went down like a lead balloon, particularly in Tokyo and Seoul.
They didn't buy our vision of the future of war.
Either, right? They
weren't reassured by our imaginations.
Because the argument was, we used to defend you with the world's most destructive weapon, which we know goes off very nicely, thank you. And we're planning to replace that with these newfangled technologies that we're pretty sure are going to work, but lots of which are still on the, on the
more
board.
Willing to use these ones. Yeah.
They're still in the laboratory, and Seoul and Tokyo and Canberra and elsewhere said, no, thanks. What's interesting now is things have changed so much that it's now the US, and this is just the US because it's the only one that has allies in this regard, right? But it's the same goes for all of the other nuclear armed powers. None of them are developing these things at the expense of their nuclear capabilities. No one anymore is proposing to rely more on these strategic non-nuclear weapons than they will on nukes. They're going to rely on them as well as, and allies love that.
Right? That's super dangerous stuff too. Like, because you're taking, it's like, okay, nuclear revolution plus this third nuclear age shit, and like,
and you didn't think that was possibly a bad idea. I can't get my head around it. But yeah, that's the thing that allies are into. And so that's where, you know, so we talked about AUKUS earlier. You know, part of AUKUS is helping Australia to get some of these strategic non-nuclear weapons, including hypersonics. Japan is into this too. There's no doubt the Koreans are only a step behind, but they're there as well. So NATO has its own kind of missile defense program. NATO is very interested in hypersonics. In fact, from memory, that NATO, there is an official NATO hypersonics thing. You know, it becomes one of those kind of technologies du jour, right? Everyone has to, you know,
it's happening right now, and
right?
It's not being scrutinized enough.
And so that's what's really interesting in terms of the extended deterrence thing. Allies are no longer as hostile to it because they don't see it as coming at the expense of extended nuclear deterrence. They see it as potentially bolstering it. My argument to those allies, including my own country, is be really careful here. It may not bolster deterrence how you think it will. If it pushes nuclear armed states into feeling more rather than less vulnerable, you may be, it's the Goldilocks problem, right? How much is too much? Just enough to deter, but not too much to make them want to go first. I think these weapons push us into that latter category. So you're not safer as a result of
it. This is why you need more thinking on this, everybody, because like what allies think that they want, or what politicians say they want in allied capitals is not going to be good for the allies.
Often isn't,
it's not good for stability.
Think about it. Exactly.
Like, ultimately these weapons that you want, like South Korea, if it fucking causes a nuclear war, obviously it wasn't a good idea.
Right? You know? Yeah, exactly. And this is the thing where like the mentality currently is, and I get it because China seems aggressive, seems threatening, particularly if you, as we said before, if you don't have the baseline for thinking about power in Asia, you just look at Chinese growth in military capabilities in a vacuum, that seems threatening and aggressive and so forth. And then you look at the kind of state that it is, do that kind of regime type analysis, and you say, and they're an authoritarian state that has no regard for human rights and all the rest. Like that also could translate into aggressive, threatening things in foreign policy terms. Although my answer to that always is show me a great power that doesn't act like this. Just it seems to be a trait of great power politics. But hey, I actually don't think regime type matters that much ultimately. But I get where the concern comes from, right? But then the response to it is, so what we need to do is increase our ability to threaten China. And that's where someone like me comes in and says, are you sure about that? You don't have to like them.
What does that get you?
And you're not giving them the house, but having a nuclear armed great power that has great capabilities, military capabilities, but is really nervous about being able to keep them. That's an unstable order that I don't think increases Australian or South Korean or Japanese or even American security. That's a less secure world.
Yeah,
but if you only think of it in these one way, like that's where we're going to end up.
Yeah, I mean the dilemma, where this leaves me is like the dilemmas, the traps, the paradoxes that come with inherent to the deterrence way of thinking makes it obvious to me that like you're not going to get anything remotely close to a durable security as long as you're solely hostage to like the fear-based constructs. It doesn't mean that you ignore them. It doesn't mean that you don't like rely on them as some kind of intermediary step or something. But like if this is your horizon, then we're fucked. I mean, like this shit's gonna go up in flames at some point, you know?
Yeah, I think I'm with you on that. That's why I'm like, I think deterrence is the best thing we have now, particularly in the absence of restraint through arms control. If you're going to trash all the arms control treaties, we have literally one strategic arms control treaty left between the two major nuclear armed powers. And actually, when we say it's left, the Russians have just announced that they're suspending participation.
Yeah.
So it's basically DOA, right?
Almost doesn't exist.
It's kind of the weekend at Bernie's of arms control treaties, right? And that's the first time since 1972 that we've lived in a world without strategic arms control between the two major nuclear armed powers. So if you're going to not do that, that puts more pressure on deterrence. You've got to get deterrence just right. And as you said, like deterrence is hard. Threatening another state so that they don't attack you, but not threatening them so much that they become convinced that you're about to attack first and therefore they should act. And realizing that we're both trying to threaten and deter each other, and getting that back is really, really difficult. And I think the problem currently is we are approaching it in extraordinarily simplistic ways. And by trashing arms control, taking those guardrails off, we've just piled the pressure onto the deterrence piece.
I mean, somewhat this is a future research thing, I suspect, but like so much of what we do in the name of deterrence is not deterrence. And so
Exactly.
like
Yeah.
there's a category error in most of what we're doing. We talk
Exactly.
about
Yeah.
deterrence because it sounds more legitimate. And like that's just not
Not all threats are deterrent threats.
yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyways.
We're a bright, cheery couple of chaps to chat
Yeah.
to on a Wednesday morning, aren't we?
But this was awesome, dude. This
Likewise.
might have to
Lovely
turn this into
chat.
2 episodes actually, but that's all the better.
Cool.
Yeah. Man,
it's
so
a great
fun.
podcast, man. And the fact that there are outlets now to have these kind of conversations where you can work through these things and, you know, like get a whole bunch of things wrong. We'll have said a bunch of things in the last almost 2 hours that contradict ourselves
Oh
or don't
yeah,
add up
I
or
say
whatever
shit
it
all
is,
the
right?
time, and I'm like, wait a minute.
Yeah, hang on, that doesn't quite work, does it? Right? And that's fine, right? That's what you do as a decent scholar, to work through things and you change your mind and you get convinced by others and whatever. But having these outlets to have these kind of conversations, it seems fleetingly rare or increasingly rare these days. So let me finish by saying, go up the Undiplomatic podcast. It's a fine thing.
Thanks, man. Yeah, thanks for coming on. Guest again is Ben Zala from ANU. This has been great. Yeah, be in touch.